I'm in the basement, and forgive the mess. You've seen this lathe in many other videos of mine, and it's badged at a Craftsman. As a Craftsman, you might see them as an Atlas. This was manufactured in 1976, but I acquired it about 1990 from a dead man, and you know, that's how you're able to buy some of these lathes, as these older people pass away. And I have received quite a few offensive comments of people waiting for me to die, but you know, we're all going to die, I guess. But these lathes also came in different lengths, possibly not from Sears, but the length of the bed, of course, changes the length of the distance between centers. But again, it's 12 inch, which means that you can swing a 12 inch disc in here. It has a quick change gearbox. By then I think they all have the quick change gearbox, thank goodness. There's a carriage stop. I think I got 2 of those. Many of the parts are similar to the other lathe, although I'm not sure they interchange and what changes have taken place, but you can look at your parts list to determine that. The reason I'm spending so much time talking about these lathes is I think that an educated person that is knowledgeable on the subject can make wise decisions as to the purchase. But make sure your lathe has a decent motor on it, that right away you don't have to replace the motor. And often you're going to see them with cheap appliance motors or something that somebody just made do with. But that's a quality Craftsman 1-horse motor, and it is 220 volt. So make sure you check the voltage, and that it isn't a 3-phase motor or a high voltage, and you do not have that in your home. And more than likely you won't have a 3-phase in your home, then you would have to buy a 3-phase converter. So check that out. And another thing important, take somebody with you, like the Joker or your dad or some other person that is knowledgeable on the subject of lathes, and they can help advise you and determine whether the lathe is in good condition or not. I think that a reversing switch is a handy thing to have. And then another thing I wanted you to notice on this particular lathe, well, really all of the Atlas Craftsman lathes, other than the really old ones and that small one that I showed you, will be equipped with Timken tapered roller bearings, and that decal to me is a sign of a quality spindle. Now, one other thing here, that I've talked about back gears, and the other Craftsman lathe out in the garage certainly does have back gears, and this lathe, in fact, we call it back gears, but the gears aren't in the back, they're down below. And I guess we could call them below gears, but this operates the so-called back gears or below gears, as opposed to the lever back there that you'll see on some of the other lathes. And right down there is one of the so-called back or below gears, and the other one right down here. So just getting some nomenclature correct, although I will refer to it as back gears. When I bought this, it came with many tool holders as well as a quick change, but it's not an Aloris. It is in fact a Uhas, which isn't bad, other than it is the type that has the plunger rather than the wedge here, which I don't think is as good, but it's serviceable. I made an extra T-bolt for the other lathe, and there's at least one more. Now the reason I got an M on there is this required metric hex keys, so that's just a reminder to me. So that's the first set of quick change that I have, but now I got several of them. But this came with it, and I was very happy. So there's the model number. And I made a note to myself in here. And this is good. Spiral bound, perfect shape, and all of the parts in the back. But you can find these parts lists on the Sears site as well. But look here what I wrote down. I'm glad I did. I paid, there's the auction, in May of '93. I paid $695 for that, and at that time it was on a rickety homemade wooden stand. I did use it that way for a couple of years, and then I built and welded up a heavy-duty stand. The motor is in the rear. Now let me tell you real briefly about dealing with widows. And some of you have said to me that, oh, I bought something so cheap from a widow woman and all she wanted to do was get rid of her husband and stuff. She's just giving it away. But I find them hard to deal with, although they're wonderful, dear ladies, but they always think someone is trying to take advantage of them. And they know that their husband loved this stuff and probably paid a lot for it, and they had to sacrifice for it out of the family budget, and she is not about to let it go cheap, but even a fair offer is often turned down, and she will always tell you, well, I got to talk to my son who lives in Hawaii, and he's coming in next year, and he'll help me. So, you know, it's just hard to deal with them, so just walk away if that happens to you. I have more chucks than Carter has pills, and I'm not ashamed of it. This is a little buck adjust true that you've seen, about a 3.5 inch or so, and that's my favorite lately. But here's another one that's even a little bit smaller. And I do a lot of small work. Also, you will see these Jacobs chucks made in several different sizes. This one goes up to 5/8, but you can see that that has the 1.5 8 thread, and these are nice too, other than you have quite a long distance here away from the rigidity of the spindle. Let's see, what else do I have here. Here's yet another one, a little 4-jaw that I sometimes put into just into a 3-jaw chuck, but that's causes it to stick way out. That's a little, oh, it says made in England, but it's a rather nice little chuck. This is the actual 4-jaw that came with this lathe, and this is the actual 3-jaw that came with it, and there was an extra set of jaws for these. And when you're buying a lathe, look around to make sure that you have the extra jaws. If they're around there, you don't lose them, because you'll never be able to purchase a set of jaws that will match that, that particular chuck. I do have a collet attachment for this lathe, and as I told you a little while ago, these are 3C collets, and these are imports. And there's the adapter and the thread protector and a spanner, but this drawbar is actually off of a south bend and will fit my south bend. But in order for it to fit this lathe, all I had to do was manufacture this plastic spacer sleeve here, because it was too long. And that's, of course, threaded. And I do dearly love this. If possible, well, your lathe's either going to have one or not, and I would say that 98% of them probably did not have collet attachments, but they sure are handy. And I have some square collets for this, or hex, I should say, someplace. Guess they're not there. They're in a, yeah, they're still in the containers over here. And this is a collet, not a collet. This is an end mill holder that goes right into the spindle with the drawbar, and that's used in conjunction with the milling attachments, which I'll show you here momentarily. I also use a genuine Aloris, that's the size A, and I have quite an abundance of these. I'm blessed, I should say. And you've seen me use it as a turret lathe with this tailstock turret. I usually keep my extra jaws bundled and marked as to what chuck that they fit. These lathes have, I told you, 16 speeds, spindle speeds, and they have a lot of different feeds and threading capability, but in my opinion, they never had a feed that was slow enough to give a real fine finish. And I have shown this in another video. This is a gadget that I made that has a variable speed motor that drives the tailstock or the lead screw from the tailstock end, and I can get an extremely fine feed with that. So that's a shortcoming of Atlas lathes, and they're all made that way, and I've heard other people complain about it as well. And up above here I got about every little lathe dog and extra tools and chucks and different attachments. And get yourself a, if I can find it here, up there, get yourself a keyless chuck, an Albrecht. This is actually a Jacobs. And get yourself spring-loaded live centers as well as regular ball bearing type centers. The more attachments you have, the more pleasurable it is to operate your lathe. This is the milling attachment for an Atlas Craftsman. They make a smaller one too that fits on that 6-inch, believe it or not. And this fits onto the cross slide. You have to remove the compound and it goes on there. It can be set at different angles, and that's shown in some of my videos. And that's certainly a nice attachment to have if you do not have a milling machine. I seldom use this because I own a Bridgeport, but it can be useful. It also has its limitations. It's relatively light, so it's for light cuts and light duty. But get yourself one. You can also use the Palmgren milling attachment. I have one of those that I've shown in other videos too, and because that will fit virtually any lathe. When I purchased this lathe, this drilling 2-axis attachment came with it, and in fact it was mounted on the lathe. So they had been doing some milling. I think the guy worked on guns. And I want it for a drill press, but it's got a little set of jaws on it. But I think you recall how rusty this table was, and that's one that I cleaned up with in one of my de-rusting videos. And I never have done anything with this yet, but you can see that round dovetail looks a lot like what you see on the lathe itself, and this attaches just like that milling attachment I showed you a few moments ago. These are kind of hard to find, and I think it's really something you would very seldom use, especially if you have a milling machine. So again, what do you watch out for? A lot of the things that I showed you on the other lathes. Look for gears that are damaged. Do not buy it again if you have any damaged gears in here, unless you want a major job. If you're looking for a project, you got one. Also, you can examine the gears in here, but that's something that's kind of hard to do when you're at an auction or in a basement or something. You're just going to have to take it for what it is and accept it. But you can look underneath here and see some of the gears, but it's going to be dirty. There's going to be chips under there, but you would need a mirror and a flashlight in order to look at that. Don't worry about the belt. You can change the belt, but again, it's not easy to do. And I'm all for using those linked belts where you don't have to take the spindle apart. It might seem like a lazy man's way of doing it, but that's my method. On the more modern Atlas lathes like this, again, instead of having a breakaway bearing near the tailstock end, this is the clutch that would give away if you had a crash. That's it right there. This lathe had a 1 horsepower capacitor start motor, and it also sets pretty much by gravity to tighten the belt, but it works pretty well. But again, all of these Atlas lathes to me are a bit of a rattle trap compared to, say, running a Hardinge or some really high-end lathe. However, I do like my Atlas lathe. Again, examine the bed, and there are some nicks here. Some pretty good nicks right there, but they won't hurt anything. I don't know if I put those on there, or I think I'll blame it on the former owner. Also, you can use your lathe for grinding if you have a Dumore tool post grinder, and I have several you've seen me use. Notice here on the cranks here, these graduated dials are so much larger in diameter than the other one, and they're much easier to read, although these are not satin chrome, whereas you're going to see on the Clausing lathe and some that they're satin chrome, which makes them even easier to read. And here's what I told you about the broken crank, and since it's been finished off, I think that the man just didn't like it and said, sawed it off. So you can crank like that without it hitting your knuckles. You can also determine if there's any broken gears in here by cranking it very carefully and feeling if there's any clicking or any funny feelings or noises as you turn this. And crank your cross slide back and forth and see how that operates. Is there a lot of damage right here? Again, none on this lathe at all, none. You may recall that earlier I talked about a dauber and a little grease hole here for your white lead, and notice that that is lacking in more modern lathes because they expect you to use ball bearing centers rather than the old dead centers. But I took the quill out now so I could show you what I was talking about here in terms of the condition of it, but you're always going to see some damage in there. Matter of fact, this one's far worse than what I thought, but again, that's due to drills or chucks slipping in there. Can you see that? Now there's not too much you can do about that other than to buy a new one if they're still available, but I suspect you couldn't buy that for $200. But here's a cure for that, and this is a number 2 Morse taper reamer, which you can purchase, but they won't be cheap. But those can be put into a quill and just gently turn, and that will remove the high spots. You wouldn't expect to ream it enough to totally clean that up, but it will help, and you can see there's just a few little chips on there that remove the high spots. But you'll have to take what I say here with a grain of salt in regards to some of these defects that you're going to see, because unless the lathe has been unused, you're going to find things wrong with it. But by the same token, you're going to do damage and cause wear on it yourself just by using it, because that's the nature of tools. Should you come into a shop where the lathe is for sale and you see they've been doing grinding in that area or some other filthy work, and the chips are piled up and just everything looks neglected, you can be sure that they also neglected to lubricate the machine, and that they are just sloppy people, and maybe you don't want to own that. But I know how excited you can get when you see something for sale and you want it, and you live in an area where these things aren't available, and finally you see one, and again, consider buying it and then enjoying it for a while and selling it when you find a better one. These are compounds off of a 9-inch South Bend lathe. I know this is an Atlas, but I wanted to show you what you might expect to find in a school. This is what they should look like. A little bit of chipping right there, that's acceptable. And someone has drilled and tapped holes in there for some reason we will never know. But this one has been broken out by a football player tightening the tool post too tight. But look at how they have rammed that against the chuck hundreds of times over the years. This is ruined, totally ruined, but I kept it for an example. But as a teacher, sometimes you would hear this horrible rumbling sound as the kids ran the compound into the chuck, and they're using a power feed and they really didn't know how to turn it off, and finally the lathe just stalled and stopped. That's why they put flat belts on South Bend lathes, so they would slip. That was the safety clutch. Here are some of the other accessories I've acquired over time, not necessarily from when I bought the machines, but I got all kinds of wrenches, and here's tool holders, right, left, straight, cut-off tool, and you'll find these in straights as well. I don't really like these. I like the Aloris. Threading tools, knurling tools. There's something I really hate. They don't work. There's another type of threading tool, the gooseneck you've seen me use. Various kinds of boring bar holders, but again the Aloris is far superior. Those come in different sizes. This is a reversible one. You can use it like that or flip it over and use it like that. And your boring bar, of course, goes in here. There's another kind, but you can see how flimsy looking that looks. There'd be no rigidity at all. There's another type of Armstrong boring bar holder that's pretty sturdy. And there's a host of other holders that you can buy as well, but you're much going to prefer the quick change type, I'm sure, although they can cost as much as the lathe itself. There's your mouse urine at work again. If the lathe you're looking at was owned by a hammer and chisel mechanic, don't buy it. It's that simple. This is the kind of dog plate or drive plate that is sold with the lathe. And you can see I haven't used this very much. This one came with one of the lathes, I forgot which, but it doesn't look like a quality piece. It's very thin. It is painted rather than machined. I don't know why they painted over that. And it doesn't appear to be balanced, whereas this better one, and I'm not sure where I got it, is so much heavier. It feels like about double the weight. And it does say Atlas. I put that on there. But it's been balanced, and it's just a nice piece. Much more rigid. So watch for quality like that. So that's kind of obvious that this looks like junk. Almost like maybe this is off of a woodworking lathe. I won't talk about the tailstock because that was covered in the other one. And just the general condition of the lathe is what you're worried about. Don't buy it if it's in a building with a leaky roof. You know, you just want to avoid situations like that unless you get the thing for 50 bucks. So how much is this lathe worth now? I think, what did I pay? $6.75 for it, and that's quite a while ago. This lathe, again, could be worth anywhere between $500 and even $2,000. I think $2,000 would be way too much, but if you find one in absolute perfect condition with all the attachments, it probably is still a fair price. But consider the cost of moving it if you have to pay to rent a truck or a trailer or some help. And all of that, but and if you whether or not you can afford it. If you've got a budget where you know you're earning a good income, you can pay $2,000 for it. Now I have discussed only American-made lathes here, the Craftsman and the Atlas, and I'm going to get around to the other brands later on. But you certainly have a good opportunity to look at some of the imports as well. But if you want American-made, this is what you're going to find. And remember that there's probably a greater abundance of the Atlas Craftsman by far than any other brand. And that's why I've spent so much time on this. And this video has turned into a bit of a filibuster, I must confess. So I'm going to wrap things up right now and saying I hope this helped you now when you go to buy a lathe. And this is tubalcain saying, so long for now.